In 2014 and 2015, something unthinkable happened. Thousands of young people, many of them schoolgirls, packed a bag and left apparently prosperous and free countries like Britain, France, and Canada to travel across continents to a war zone controlled by ISIS. Here in Britain, the girls were dubbed ISIS brides. There have been thousands of headlines portraying the girls who traveled to Syria as dangerous traitors. To cite just one example, Piers Morgan tweeted to his 7.9 million followers that Shamima Begum was a lying, sniveling, cold-hearted, self-serving ISIS bride monster who should rot in the terror bed she made for herself. Half a decade later, our government tells us that the girls who are still in Syria are a threat to national security, that they are so dangerous, so irredeemable, that they must be stripped of their citizenship and left in desert prisons in North-East Syria. They tell us that these girls chose to join a violent terrorist organization and were intent on doing harm. They tell us that they stayed until the end because they were ideological hardliners and that they must be kept out to keep Britain safe. But who are the girls and young women who traveled to Syria and Iraq and lived under ISIS? Were they all would-be terrorists, hell-bent on violence and destruction? Or were there other forces at play, manipulating and coercing them? How do we explain why these girls left and why they're still there? And most importantly, how can we stop something like this from happening again? As the director of a legal human rights organization, these kinds of questions go to the heart of my work. All of my clients are people who governments, and sometimes the public, have decided are so bad, so monstrous even, that they're deserving of punishment, from imprisonment to execution. But when I meet my clients face to face, the reality is always more complex than the government or media narrative. And nowhere is this contrast more striking than in the context of Syria and of the women accused of affiliation with ISIS. So I would like to tell you a few stories about some of my clients. I'm going to give them pseudonyms to protect their identities. The first is Yasmina. Yasmina is now in her 20s. She was 17 when she met Mario on an online dating site for single Muslims. He asked her to marry him just a couple of weeks after meeting. It was early, but Yasmina found him charming and he ticked the right boxes. After they married, he changed. He became controlling and was violent to Yasmina. He criticized the things she wore, the things she said, told her she couldn't hang out with her non-Muslim friends. Then, a couple of months into her first pregnancy, Mario disappeared. 3 weeks later, he called her from Syria. He wanted her to join him there. She refused and they fought. Eventually, she agreed to meet him in Turkey and see if they could work things out. But when she arrived in Turkey, Mario was nowhere to be seen. She was approached by 2 friends of his who said they'd take her to him. She was heavily pregnant in an unknown country and couldn't speak the language. She was moved from car to car, smuggler to smuggler, until finally being deposited in Syria. There, she was locked in a guarded house and told she had to wait for her husband. When Mario finally arrived, she asked him why he had lied to her. Laughing, Mario said, "If I had told you the truth, you would never have come here. Yasmina was trapped. She was in ISIS territory with a husband who had no intention of allowing her and her child to leave. She eventually did manage to make it out and into Kurdish territory, which is where I later met her and her daughter in a prison camp in North-East Syria. It was here that I also met Amira, and she's the second girl I want to tell you about. Amira was a teenager when she traveled to Syria. She had grown up in a predominantly white town, the daughter of strict immigrant parents who didn't let her go out on her own or stay the night at friends' houses. When she was 15, she had managed to persuade her parents to get her a phone for emergencies. For Amira, this phone was like a portal to a new world. She made friends with other teenagers on Twitter and Facebook. They chatted about clothes, celebrities, dating, their parents. But they also shared articles about things that were happening in the world, like Bagram, Guantanamo, the war in Syria. Amira was struck by these articles, in particular by the narratives about Muslims being abused or treated as second-class citizens in the West. And she thought about her own experiences, about the times her mother had been shouted at with racist abuse, or the time someone scrawled, "Go home, ninjas," on their car. It was around this time that an older woman made contact with the teenagers on Twitter. She started telling them about Syria, encouraging them to go there. She made it sound romantic, exciting, important. In hindsight, Amira can see that she and her friends were being manipulated and groomed. But at the time, they didn't see it, so they said they were interested in going. From there, everything was arranged for them. They were told what to do, where to go, who to speak to, what to say, what to wear, everything down to the last detail. Once Amira had taken that first step, she told me she felt like she couldn't turn back. Her handlers told her that if anyone found out she had been speaking with them, she would be arrested and imprisoned. They told her that she'd already gone too far, that the police would be after her. Amira's fear was real. There were stories going around the community of police raiding people's houses, of people being arrested and harassed, their possessions or their children taken from them. To the young and inexperienced teenager, leaving now felt like her only option. When Amira got to Syria, she was taken by masked men with guns to a building. She was locked inside with hundreds of other women. The windows were nailed shut, and there were armed guards patrolling outside. The women there told her, the only way out of here is marriage. She lived for 5 years under ISIS before finally making it out. When I met her, she reflected on how the place that she had been told about as a teenager, this land of freedom, belonging, safety, love, had turned out to be nothing but exploitation and abuse. Layla, the last woman I want to mention, said something similar about life under ISIS. But unlike the teenager, Layla was a grown adult when she traveled to Syria. She was a mother who went with her 3 children. So on the face of it, Layla's actions seem the hardest to understand. But in many ways, her story is the least remarkable. Layla had moved to Europe to be with her husband, who she had married when she was a teenager. She didn't speak the local language, and she didn't have any qualifications. She and her husband had 3 children, and they lived in a small apartment. It was in 2014 that her husband first started saying he wanted to leave. He had lost his job, and the roof of the apartment was leaking. He told her that if they left, he would have a new job and they would have a house. He said he had friends in Syria who had sorted everything out for them. He had made up his mind. He was going to take the children. She was his wife. It was her duty to support him. So Layla followed him. But shortly after the family arrived in Syria, her husband was killed. Layla was left in a war zone with 3 young children, no money, couldn't speak the language, and had no means of escape. To survive and to protect her children, she was forced to marry again. Layla told me that she lived those years in a state of terror, that she was trapped between the violence and rage of her new husband and the terrible fear of what ISIS could do to her and her children if she tried to escape. Layla, Amira, and Yasmina all have different stories, but they've all been treated in similar ways by their governments and by the Western media. When they arrived in Kurdish territory, they were detained alongside thousands of other girls, women, and children. Journalists flocked in, and headlines about the ISIS brides and cubs of the caliphate proliferated. They were uniformly labeled as terrorists, and governments used this to justify exiling them and their children from their homelands. 3 years on, many of those girls and young women are still in detention in North-East Syria. They've been stripped of their citizenship, their children deprived of medical and humanitarian assistance, and most significantly, cut off completely from the rule of law. They are detained without charge or trial in conditions so bad that children die almost daily. This is what I find most shocking when I visit my clients in the camp, and what they find most confusing and distressing. That rather than give them a hearing, rather than bring them home and prosecute them for any crimes they may be alleged to have committed, as we would do in any other context, they have been left to languish indefinitely in a legal and political black hole. Our governments will tell us that those girls left their countries to join a violent terrorist organization, that they were intent on doing harm, that they stayed until the end because they were ideological hardliners, and that to keep us safe, they must be kept away. But in the cases I've worked on and the stories I've told you about, it wasn't violence and hatred that motivated them. It was a false promise of belonging, community, freedom, or love, sold to them by individuals who exploited their vulnerability. And we must be clear, these girls did not stay because they wanted to. They stayed because they had no means of escape. But not everyone seeking belonging, community, freedom, or love ends up traveling to a war zone. So what made these girls different? Well, the more I've researched this topic, the less different I think they were. In fact, the majority of my cases fit the textbook definition of trafficking. Many of them were children when they traveled to Syria. They had been abused by partners or criminal gangs, and they had been identified as targets by a sophisticated trafficking operation. Most came from marginalized backgrounds. They had experienced alienation and social isolation. Some had experienced racism and harassment, Islamophobic attacks, or religious discrimination. Others had been abused or were in coercive relationships. With Layla, Amira, and Yasmina, each of them had a story about being othered in their home countries, whether it was the graffiti on the car that said "Ninjas, get out," or being pushed and attacked on the train, or the threatening visits from police officers. These incidents alone weren't enough to make them want to leave, but in the hundreds of hours of conversations that I've had with women in Syria and their families, these experiences, coupled with the promise of freedom, belonging, community, and love, were exploited by criminal actors with an agenda, like charming Mario or the older woman on Twitter. So, while some of these women will, of course, have to face justice for their actions and choices. By adopting these extraordinary measures, by treating everyone as terrorists, by declaring them all guilty without a trial, by refusing to consider their individuality or afford them basic human rights, as we would do in any other circumstance with any other group, we are choosing to alienate and to other them, to dehumanize and to degrade. And the tragedy of this approach is that it was exactly this kind of alienation and othering that made these girls and young women susceptible to the tactics, grooming, and propaganda of ISIS traffickers in the first place. I believe we're at a crossroads as a society, and we have a choice. We can choose to view the detainees in Syria as a homogenous group of monsters, as terrorists or ISIS brides. We can choose to cast them out, to strip them and their children of rights, to alienate and dehumanize them. This is the simple option. Or we can choose to look beyond the headlines and treat them as individuals. We can ask to hear their stories. We can afford them rights. We can judge them in courts designed for that purpose. And in the meantime, we can protect those who need protection, like children or the victims of ISIS. This is the harder option. I began this talk by telling you that in 2014 and 2015, something unthinkable happened. That thousands of young people, many of them schoolgirls, packed a bag and left apparently prosperous and free countries like Britain, France, and Canada to travel across continents to a war zone controlled by ISIS. If we want to prevent something like this from happening again, if we truly want to protect society and prevent future harm, then we have to choose the harder option. We have to stop labeling, alienating, and dehumanizing, and we have to start rehumanizing. We have to start asking why this happened. And we have to be ready to really listen to the answer. Thank you all for listening.